Most people never understand why an empath stays in situations that slowly destroy them from the inside. They assume the empath is weak, emotionally dependent, or afraid to let go. But the truth is much deeper than that. An empath stays because they see things other people fail to notice. They see pain hidden beneath cold behavior. They see fear hiding behind anger. They see wounded emotions behind toxic actions. While most people judge what they see on the surface, the empath searches for the reason underneath it all. That is why empaths often remain loyal to people who continuously disappoint them. They do not focus only on what a person is doing in the present moment. They focus on who that person could become one day. They believe people can heal. They believe damaged people can grow. They believe love, patience, and understanding can inspire transformation. And because of that belief, they continue giving chances long after everyone else would have walked away. When someone becomes emotionally distant, the empath searches for hidden pain. When someone lies, the empath wonders what fear caused the dishonesty. When someone behaves badly, the empath tries to understand the emotional wound behind the behavior instead of immediately condemning the person. This is what makes empaths compassionate human beings, but it is also what places them in dangerous emotional situations. Over time, the empath begins carrying emotional weight that was never theirs to carry. They become the problem solver, the emotional caretaker, the one constantly trying to fix what keeps breaking. They excuse behavior that should never be excused because they desperately want to believe change is possible. They hold on to hope because hope feels less painful than acceptance. But eventually, something inside them starts shifting. The same arguments repeat themselves. The same disappointments return again and again. Promises are made, broken, and repeated until the words lose all meaning. Slowly, the empath begins noticing patterns instead of isolated incidents. And patterns are impossible to ignore because they reveal consistency. A mistake may happen once, but repeated behavior reveals character. This is where the first emotional crack begins forming. The empath realizes they are the only one fighting to keep the relationship alive. They are the only one communicating, understanding, forgiving, sacrificing, and trying to repair the damage. Meanwhile, the other person becomes comfortable receiving endless compassion without giving the same energy in return. Most people never notice when an empath begins emotionally breaking, because empaths suffer silently. They continue smiling while emotionally exhausted. They continue supporting others while secretly feeling alone themselves. But deep inside, exhaustion is slowly replacing hope. And once an empath becomes emotionally tired, everything begins changing forever. There comes a moment in every empath's life when the pain stops feeling accidental. At first, they believe misunderstandings are the reason for the emotional wounds. They believe communication can fix the problem. They believe honesty, patience, and love will eventually create change. Every time they are hurt, they tell themselves the other person simply does not understand the damage being caused. So they explain their feelings again. They give another chance. They remain hopeful even when the relationship keeps draining them emotionally. But over time, reality starts becoming impossible to ignore. The empath begins noticing that the same behaviors continue happening even after clear conversations. The same boundaries continue being crossed. The same disrespect continues appearing in different forms. At first, the empath still searches for explanations. They blame stress, trauma, fear, emotional wounds, or personal struggles. Because empaths naturally look deeper than surface behavior, they often spend years trying to understand people who continue hurting them repeatedly. Then one painful question suddenly changes everything. What if they already know they are hurting me? That realization cuts deeper than betrayal itself, because now the issue is no longer confusion, the issue becomes awareness. The empath starts recognizing that the other person fully understands what creates emotional pain and still continues the behavior anyway. This creates a heartbreak that feels almost impossible to describe. The empath begins seeing manipulation more clearly. Not obvious manipulation in the beginning, but emotional confusion, guilt, excuses, and constant blame shifting. Slowly, the empath is made to feel responsible for problems they did not create. They begin questioning their own reactions instead of questioning the behavior causing the pain. Because empaths naturally self-reflect, they often become trapped in these emotional cycles longer than most people. Meanwhile, their kindness becomes expected, their patience becomes taken for granted, their forgiveness becomes something the other person relies on instead of appreciates. The empath notices that every apology sounds familiar, every promise feels temporary, and every effort to repair the relationship comes mostly from them. That is when emotional exhaustion begins turning into emotional clarity. The empath slowly realizes they are grieving an illusion more than the actual relationship. They are grieving the version of the person they believed existed. They are grieving the future they imagined together. They are grieving the hope that kept them staying through countless disappointments. And once that illusion starts breaking apart, emotional distance quietly begins forming inside the empath's heart. They become quieter, less emotionally available, and more observant. Not because they stopped caring, but because their soul is finally trying to protect itself from more damage. Most people think the empath suddenly changed one day. But the truth is the transformation was built through repeated pain, silent heartbreak, and the devastating realization that love alone cannot change someone who refuses to change themselves. One of the most painful transformations an empath experiences happens in complete silence. There is rarely a dramatic argument, rarely a final explosion, rarely a moment where they suddenly wake up and decide to stop caring. What confuses most people is that an empath's goodbye usually begins long before anyone notices it happening. For a very long time, the empath keeps trying to save the relationship. They continue communicating even when their words are ignored. They continue giving effort even when the effort is not returned. They continue showing patience even when they are emotionally exhausted. To the outside world, it looks like everything is still normal because the empath hides their pain extremely well. But internally, something begins changing. The empath slowly starts grieving the relationship while still inside it. They mourn the connection they thought they had. They mourn the future they imagined. They mourn the emotional safety they kept hoping would eventually appear. Every broken promise leaves another emotional scar. Every ignored feeling creates more distance inside their heart. What makes this stage so difficult to understand is that empaths rarely announce how deeply they are hurting. They continue functioning normally while carrying emotional exhaustion nobody else can see. They still support others, they still smile, they still try to keep peace. But deep inside, disappointment is slowly replacing hope. Eventually, the empath notices that they are the only one fighting for the relationship anymore. They are the ones starting conversations, fixing misunderstandings, rebuilding trust, and holding everything together emotionally. Meanwhile, the other person becomes comfortable receiving love without giving the same energy back. That realization changes everything. The empath begins becoming quieter. They stop sharing every thought and feeling. They stop expecting emotional support. They stop reaching out first. Little by little, they begin emotionally stepping backward to protect themselves from more pain. Most people completely misunderstand this stage. They think the empath suddenly became distant for no reason. But the truth is, the empath already spent months, sometimes years, trying to save what kept hurting them. They already replayed conversations in their mind 1,000 times. They already cried privately. They already searched for reasons to stay. That is why the final emotional shift feels so calm. The empath stops chasing, stops begging for effort, stops trying to force understanding. And for the first time, they begin accepting reality instead of fighting against it. This is the stage where hope quietly dies. Not love, not compassion, hope. The belief that things will finally change disappears completely. Once that happens, emotional detachment begins naturally. The empath may still physically remain for a while, but emotionally they are already leaving. And when an empath truly reaches that point, their silence becomes more powerful than any argument ever could, because their heart has finally become too tired to keep bleeding for something that no longer heals. There comes a stage in an empath's life where exhaustion finally turns into clarity. For years, they kept believing things would improve. They believed another conversation would create understanding. They believed another sacrifice would finally be appreciated. They believed love was strong enough to repair what kept breaking between them and the people they cared about. But eventually, reality becomes impossible to avoid. The empath slowly realizes they cannot continue carrying relationships alone. They cannot continue healing people who refuse to heal themselves. They cannot continue sacrificing their emotional peace for people who only value them when they are giving endlessly. This is what many people fail to understand about an empath's breaking point. It is not sudden anger. It is not revenge. It is not hatred. It is the quiet moment when they finally stop believing their suffering will create change. That moment changes everything. For years, the empath was the emotional rescuer. They solved problems nobody else wanted to solve. They carried emotional burdens that did not belong to them. They remained loyal through disrespect, emotional neglect, broken trust, and repeated disappointment, because they kept hoping the connection would eventually return to what it once seemed to be. But hope slowly begins dying when patterns never change. The empath notices that they are constantly proving their worth while receiving the bare minimum in return. They are constantly trying to earn love, appreciation, consistency, and respect from people who should have freely given those things from the beginning. Eventually, this becomes emotionally exhausting. That is when the empath reaches the point of no return. They stop over-explaining their pain because they realize the problem was never communication. Their feelings were already explained many times. Their boundaries were already discussed many times. The other person understood perfectly well. The issue was never understanding. The issue was lack of genuine care. The empath also stops chasing. This surprises people the most because the empath was always the one trying to repair conflicts, restore harmony, and keep the relationship alive. But now something inside them has shifted permanently. They understand that healthy relationships cannot survive if only one person is carrying all the emotional responsibility. For the first time, the empath chooses themselves, not because they became selfish, because they became emotionally exhausted from abandoning themselves for everyone else. This transformation often appears cold from the outside, but it is actually the beginning of self-respect. The empath is finally protecting their peace instead of endlessly sacrificing it. They stop forcing connections that no longer feel safe. They stop begging for consistency. They stop waiting for people to become who they promised they would be. And perhaps the most powerful part of this transformation is how quiet it becomes. No dramatic speeches, no revenge, no chaos, just acceptance. The empath finally accepts reality for what it truly is instead of holding on to fantasies about what it could become. And once an empath reaches that level of clarity, there is usually no going back to the version of themselves that tolerated endless emotional pain in the name of love. One of the hardest truths an empath ever learns is that potential does not mean reality. For years, they stayed connected to people because they believed in who those people could eventually become. They focused on future change instead of present behavior. They held on to promises instead of patterns. And because of that, they often remained trapped in emotionally painful situations far longer than they should have. At first, the empath convinces themselves that patience is love. They believe enduring emotional pain proves loyalty. They believe sacrifice is necessary to keep relationships alive. Every time they are disappointed, they tell themselves things will improve with enough understanding, enough communication, enough support, or enough time. But slowly, emotional exhaustion begins replacing emotional hope. The empath notices that no matter how much they give, the relationship continues draining them. They are constantly trying to create emotional stability while the other person continues creating emotional confusion. They are constantly pouring energy into people who only appreciate them when they are sacrificing themselves. That realization becomes deeply painful because the empath finally understands something they avoided for years. Love cannot survive without mutual effort. No amount of compassion can fix someone who refuses accountability. No amount of patience can heal someone who continues choosing harmful behavior. And no amount of sacrifice can force emotional maturity into someone who is comfortable remaining emotionally unavailable. This is where the empath begins changing in powerful ways. They stop romanticizing struggle. They stop believing chaos is proof of deep love. They stop confusing emotional intensity with emotional connection. For the first time, they begin understanding that healthy love should not constantly leave them emotionally exhausted. The empath also starts reconnecting with themselves again. For so long, they were focused on healing everyone else that they completely abandoned their own emotional needs. They ignored their intuition, ignored their boundaries, ignored the quiet inner voice warning them that something was deeply unhealthy. But now they begin listening to themselves again. They start asking difficult questions. Why was I accepting less than I deserved? Why was I constantly trying to prove my worth? Why was I begging for consistency from people who clearly knew how to give it but chose not to? Those questions slowly lead the empath toward emotional freedom. For the first time in a long time, peace begins feeling more attractive than attachment. The empath realizes they no longer want relationships built on confusion, inconsistency, emotional neglect, or endless disappointment. They want calmness, honesty, safety, respect, mutual effort. And once they experience even a small amount of emotional peace, everything changes. Chaos no longer feels exciting. It feels exhausting. The empath becomes more selective about who receives their energy. They stop giving endless access to people who only bring emotional instability into their lives. They begin protecting their heart instead of constantly sacrificing it. This is where true healing begins. Not when the empath stops loving others, but when they finally begin loving themselves enough to stop accepting relationships that slowly destroy their spirit. When an empath finally walks away for real, something inside them changes permanently. It is not just the end of a relationship, it is the end of the version of themselves that kept sacrificing their peace to keep everyone else comfortable. For years, the empath ignored their own emotional wounds while trying to heal the wounds of others. They over-explained their feelings, overgave their energy, and overextended their patience, hoping love would eventually be returned in the same way they gave it. But eventually, they reach emotional exhaustion, not because they stopped caring, because they cared too deeply for too long without receiving the same emotional safety in return. This is the stage where the empath begins seeing life differently. They no longer chase people who continuously create confusion. They no longer beg for consistency, honesty, or effort. They no longer ignore their intuition simply because they want to believe the best about someone. Instead, they begin trusting actions more than words. That lesson changes everything. For most of their life, the empath focused on potential. They believed people could change if they were loved deeply enough. They believed patience could heal emotional distance. But now they understand something painful and powerful at the same time. Real change only happens when a person chooses it for themselves. No amount of sacrifice can save someone determined to remain the same. This realization creates a completely different type of empath. They still care deeply, but now their compassion includes boundaries. They still love deeply, but they no longer abandon themselves while loving others. They stop allowing guilt to control them. They stop feeling responsible for fixing every broken person who enters their life. And perhaps the most shocking part of this transformation is how calm they become. The empath, who once overreacted emotionally to every disappointment, now becomes quiet and observant. They stop arguing endlessly because they realize truth does not need to be forced onto people who refuse to understand it. They stop proving their worth because they understand genuine love never requires constant proof. People who once took the empath for granted often become confused by this new energy. The empath no longer reacts the same way, no longer chases, no longer pleads for effort. The emotional access people once had begins disappearing, not because the empath became cold, because they finally learned self-respect. And once an empath truly learns self-respect, returning to emotionally unhealthy situations becomes almost impossible. They remember the emotional damage caused by constantly ignoring their own needs. They remember the exhaustion of carrying relationships alone. They remember how painful it felt to continuously pour love into people who only appreciated them when they were sacrificing themselves. Now, peace becomes their priority. The empath starts protecting their energy carefully. They become selective about who enters their emotional world. They value honesty, emotional maturity, consistency, and mutual effort more than empty promises or temporary affection. This is the final evolution of an empath, not becoming heartless, not becoming distant, but becoming emotionally wise enough to recognize when love is slowly destroying them instead of helping them grow. And once they reach that level of clarity, their goodbye becomes permanent because they finally understand that choosing themselves is not selfish, it is survival.